Let's take a look at indexing in Python. A string, tuple, or list is an example of a sequence in Python, which is a situation in which order matters. We've seen that order matters in strings, tuples, and lists. There are other types of sequence-based data types as well. We're going to create some ourselves soon. In a sequence, we can access the individual elements. And so we've seen that with the bracket notation, the square bracket, to be able to access the individual elements. And then in some sequences, particularly right now, lists, we can not only access the elements, but we can change the individual elements. Now, an integer, for example, is not an example of a sequence in Python. We can't access, say, the fourth digit of an integer directly. The way that it's saved doesn't allow that. If we need to access the fourth integer or the fourth digit in a number, then we need to do some calculations to get there. But with strings, tuples, lists, we can access those directly, and then with a list, we can change those elements directly. So in Python, the indexing begins at 0. The first entry in a sequence has index 0. And as we've mentioned, you can think of the index as the number of entries before the one that we're talking about, at least when we're talking about a positive index. We'll see that. So let's say we have a variable named text that contains a string. And in this case, the example is the string is, here is a string. We can access the 0th entry, and that's the capital H at the beginning, right? The index 0 is the first entry in the string. But we are also able to use negative indexing, which we haven't talked about yet, but this wraps the other direction. So the -1 index is the end of the string. So we can think of starting at the beginning of the string at index 0, go in positive direction to the end of the string, but we can also go in a negative direction. So position -1, -2, -3, and so on. There are some advantages to that if we want to think about the end of a string, the last element. We don't need to know how many elements there are in the string. We can just go directly to that last one. We're able to find how many elements there are. There's a function called length, L-E-N, that will tell us how many characters there are, but sometimes we don't need to know how many. We just need to know what the last one is. And again, this is the same situation for tuples and lists. So in this particular case, this string contains 16 elements, and if you count those, you can see that there are 16 because the spaces count as characters in the string. They are part of the length of the string. If we go to the -16 position, counting backward, that gets us down back to the beginning, right? So the -1 is the end, -16 in this case is the beginning. And it turns out that we can't go outside those ranges. You can index down to -16. You can index up to +15. Beyond that, you will get the index out of range error. In this case, we see what happens if we try to index at -17. It doesn't wrap backward twice, it just goes backward one time through. In our string, here is a string, we can also look at what are called slices of the string. So we can start at a particular position and go a certain amount and take out a certain portion of the string. Again, any sequence, the string, the tuple, a list, you can do the same kind of thing. So in this case, we started at index 1, which is the E, and we go up to, but not including, index 3 in this case. And so if we slice from 1 to 3, that gives us the E and the R from here. We can also, on each side of the colon, leave a blank. So if we say, let's start at 3 and go, in this case, this means to the end, we will start at index 3, which is the E, and then go to the end of whatever the sequence happens to be. So in this case, we have E, and then the space is a string starting at index 3, going to the end of the string. If we go the other direction, leave the beginning part empty, that starts at index 0, and then this would go up to index 5. And so index 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is the space, 5 is the I. So we go from the beginning up to, but not including the I, which means that the space is part of what is output when we slice up to index 5. If we move that on up to the 6, then that would be stopping at the S, not including the S. So we would have here space I. And so the slicing, if you want a portion of a sequence, you can slice to get that portion. If you don't have anything on either side, this is slicing from the very beginning through the end, and you get the entire sequence in that case. If we count this, we see that the T is located at index 10, or alternately at index -5. And so we can also, again, access things by the positive or the negative index. And we can do slicing that involve negative indices. But in this particular case, notice that we're trying to slice from -1 to -5, and we get no output. So it doesn't break Python. It doesn't dislike the syntax, but it doesn't give us a result. And the same thing if we try to slice from -1 to 5, trying to go around the kind of in backward order in that case. But we can slice from 1 to -5. Slicing from 1 would start at 1 and go up to, but not including the position that has index -5, which would mean we would start at the E, the first E in here, and go up to, but not including the T in string. With tuples and lists, the slicing and indexing and so on work exactly the same way. So if we had values that we had in a previous video that we have a list called values, let's suppose that we make a slice of that and slice the entire thing. So new values now is going to be a list as well, but we sliced it from the beginning all the way through to the end. If we print new values, we get the same exact values, the same exact entries that values has. We can modify a list. So let's modify the 0 index value to be 5. If we look at new values, it is now 5, 50, and 300 are the entries in that list. But if we go back to the original and print values again, this time that did not change the value. We saw before that if we just said new values equal values, change new values, that would change values. But in this case, we made a slice of the entire list, and by slicing the list, it creates a new copy of everything. So we'll see a little bit more later about exactly how that works, but basically it makes a new list, copies those entries in, and then they're not referencing the same list anymore. The values match at the beginning, but then you can change those independently. So indexing for any sequence, being able to access things. With lists, we're able to access and change. Slicing allows us to access portions of a sequence rather than just individual elements. So as usual, feel free to ask any questions in the comments, by email, or on Discord.